Hi, Timothy here. Today we're looking at weddings that took the worst possible turn, showing how quickly the happiest day of someone's life can become their last.
From a bride whose ex changed his appearance to bypass security to a groom's brother who stepped in to fix what he thought was a clogged chocolate fountain, only for everything to unravel in the worst possible way. It was May 18, 2019, in Charleston, South Carolina. The old stone church sat on a quiet residential block with a low iron fence, a single gate, and a narrow walkway to the street. Nothing about it looked like a place where anyone needed to be afraid. That was the problem. Cora Pendleton was 32 years old, a third-grade teacher who kept snacks for hungry students and stayed late without being asked. 2 years earlier, she had left a marriage that turned dangerous. After she left, the stalking began. Police reports were filed. A court order required her former husband to stay at least 100 yards away from her at all times. She met Owen through a volunteer project, an architect who showed up consistently and never pushed. The relationship moved slowly, the way things do after someone has already been hurt. A year later, they were engaged.
I think about how much courage it takes to walk towards something good again after everything she had already been through.
Planning the wedding meant keeping everything quiet. No public listings, no social media. Invitations were hand-delivered to confirmed addresses. Off-duty deputies were present throughout the day. The guest list stayed under 80 people. Cora wore her late grandmother's cathedral-length veil-long lace that trailed several feet behind her. Her grandmother had passed a year before, and wearing something of hers into that moment mattered deeply to her. The ceremony ran as planned. Owen stood at the front looking like someone who could not believe his own luck. Cora walked toward him, the veil trailing quietly across the stone floor. When it ended, guests poured out all at once. Joy, noise, forward motion. The gate had been left unlatched for guests moving between the walkway and the street. The narrow walkway filled immediately. The former husband, Sean Michael, 32 years old, had approached on foot from a side block, staying just outside the 100-yard court order boundary. He had cut his hair and changed his clothing. No one on the security team identified him before he was already moving through the gate. There is something about that level of planning, the changed appearance, the measured distance, that turns this from a crime of anger into something far colder. The moment the crowd spilled out, he pushed through the unlatched gate and entered the walkway. It was packed guests shoulder to shoulder. Cora's long veil spread across the pavement behind her, leaving little room for anyone to move. A folding knife concealed inside his jacket had gone undetected. He forced his way through the guests until he was only a few feet from Cora.
Before anyone realized who he was, he pulled the knife from inside his jacket and lunged toward her.
He drove the blade once into her chest. Owen immediately tried to pull her away as nearby family members rushed forward to restrain Sean. Several guests grabbed his arms while others screamed for everyone to move back and get the children away from the walkway. Deputies stationed nearby reached the struggle within seconds, forced Sean to the ground, and disarmed him before he could strike again. Responders began treating Cora where she fell before transporting her to the nearest hospital. She underwent emergency treatment throughout the afternoon but did not survive. Cora died that evening, never reaching the reception across town. Investigators later noted that Sean made no attempt to flee, behavior they believed was consistent with someone who had planned the attack and expected to be arrested. Cell phone footage from guests recording the recessional built the foundation of the investigation. The videos confirmed his approach from the side block, his entry through the gate, and the deputy's exact response timeline. The medical examiner determined that Cora died from a single stab wound to the chest. The injury severed a major vessel and caused internal bleeding that emergency treatment could not stop. The folding knife, the active court order, and prior police reports were all entered into evidence. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He planned around every precaution put in place for her. That is the part I keep returning to. After the trial, security professionals began rethinking exit management when protective orders are involved. Cora's grandmother's veil was returned to the family. They kept it.
Stay with me. The next story begins with a celebration too. But the danger came from inside the crowd, and what a father did before anyone turned around is hard to forget.
It was September 11th, 2021 in Franklin, Tennessee. The Botanical Garden on the edge of town hosted private events on its ceremony lawn while keeping its walking paths open to the public. There was no barrier separating the two areas, just the assumption that people who did not belong to the wedding would stay on their side. Jerome Mill was 38 and had spent more than a decade building a successful electrical contracting business. He was well known in Franklin, not for self-promotion, but for doing the job right. His daughter Emma was 7 and had practiced her flower girl walk for weeks. That morning, she was dressed and ready before the groom. I picture Jerome as someone who moved through life the same way he ran his business, steadily and always the first to notice what needed handling. Before the ceremony, relatives shared photos online of Emma in her flower girl dress, the decorated garden, and the reception tables. To everyone involved, they were simply moments worth celebrating. The ceremony went without a problem. Emma walked the aisle with her basket in both hands and made the room smile without trying. After the vows, guests drifted through the garden paths toward the reception hall in loose groups.
Among the visitors using the public walking paths that morning was a man who did not belong to the wedding.
He blended in with other guests, exploring the gardens, moving casually between the pathways until he spotted Emma near the edge of the celebration. He changed direction and began closing the distance. Jerome had been keeping a loose eye on Emma through the walk of the habit of a parent with a young child in an open place. He saw the man shift direction toward her. He did not call for anyone. He moved. Jerome reached the suspect before he reached Emma, and both went to the ground on the stone garden path. Jerome was bigger, but unarmed and in formal dress. The suspect tried to break free. Jerome held on. During the struggle, Jerome's head struck the raised stone border edging the pathway. Family members pulled Emma back. The suspect broke free when Jerome went down and ran toward the public entrance, moving through outgoing visitors before anyone could stop him. The detail that stays with me is that Jerome's head hit that stone border while he was still holding on. He did not let go. Jerome was conscious when responders reached him, but got worse quickly. He was taken to the nearest hospital and treated through the night. He died the following morning. The suspect was identified as 30-year-old Ronnie Huntley and arrested within 2 days. Security footage from the garden captured him lingering near the family before the confrontation. Officers also found his vehicle parked outside the public entrance. Inside were rope, a prepaid phone, and handwritten notes outlining a planned ransom.
As the investigation continued, detectives determined that Huntley had been following the family's public social media post before the wedding.
The photos of Emma, the venue, and the reception had convinced him the family was wealthy enough to target, when in reality, the celebration had been paid for through years of savings. The medical examiner ruled Jerome's death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma after his head struck the raised stone border during the struggle. Huntley was convicted of attempted kidnapping and felony murder and is serving a life sentence. Emma went home because her father protected her from the start, and that decision cost him everything.
The next story moves indoors, where an aging glass roof, a storm nobody prepared for, and a crowd with nowhere to go turned a wedding reception into something far worse.
It was July 3rd, 2018 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. The wedding was at a small garden venue with a glass-roofed atrium used for photos, drinks, and shelter when the weather changed. The roof was old, and some panels had been marked for replacement, though still considered safe for normal use. That detail mattered when the first light rain began. Maeve Ellery was 29 and worked as a structural designer, helping make sure buildings were safe before they were ever built. She was also a bridesmaid, there to stand beside one of her closest friends and help keep the wedding moving. People knew Maeve as calm and useful, the person who noticed small problems before others did. The venue was loved for the atrium, a glass roof, plants along the walls, a stone fountain near the middle, and space for guests to gather before dinner. Staff were used to moving people there when rain came through. To them, it was shelter. Earlier, inspections had found worn roof panels. Repairs were scheduled for later in the season, but the panels had not been marked unsafe. The forecast called for rain and a normal summer storm, not hail strong enough to damage a roof.
I keep thinking about the people walking into that atrium. If someone had mentioned the roof was waiting for repairs, I doubt many of them would have chosen to stand beneath it, even for a few minutes.
After the ceremony, most guests moved into the atrium. Older relatives sat near the fountain. Parents parked strollers along the wall. Children moved around while staff carried drinks. Maeve stayed near the center with the wedding party, helping gather people for photos so the bride could breathe. At first, the rain was light. Staff opened the doors wider so guests could move in from the garden path. More people came inside than expected, but the space still felt manageable. At that point, there was no severe weather warning, only the forecast for an ordinary summer storm. So using the atrium as shelter followed the venue's normal procedure. Then the sound above them changed. Soft tapping turned into harder, uneven hits. Hail was striking the glass roof. Staff initially kept everyone inside because the atrium had always been treated as the safest place to wait out passing rain. But within minutes, a severe hail warning reached staff phones. Realizing the storm was becoming far more dangerous than expected, they immediately began guiding guests toward the side doors and inner hallway. The problem was the crowd. Elderly guests needed help standing. Small children froze at the noise. Tables and strollers made the paths tight. People were not running, but they were confused, and confusion slows everything down. By the time a stronger weather warning reached staff phones, guests were already packed inside. Maeve moved toward children near the fountain. Witnesses said she helped two reach their parents, then turned back when she saw another child crying beside a stroller. She was not trying to be a hero. She was moving the smallest people first. I don't think Maeve stopped to weigh the risk. She probably saw a frightened child and did what felt natural.
That's usually how these moments happen, not because someone wants to be remembered, but because helping someone else comes first.
The hail grew larger. A few small pieces of glass fell near the far side of the room. Staff told everyone to move out, and guests pressed harder toward the hallway. Maeve reached the stroller area, still inside the center section, when several roof panels broke loose together. Part of the weakened frame sagged as hail kept striking. Heavy glass and roof material fell into the middle before everyone could clear the space. Maeve was found on the floor near the stroller, a few feet from where the child had been standing. Other guests had pulled the child away just before the larger pieces came down. More than 20 people were hurt from glass cuts, falls, and debris. Maeve was the only person who died. Emergency crews treated people inside and took the most seriously hurt to the hospital. Attempts to save Maeve failed. The medical examiner found that Maeve died from blunt force injuries caused by the falling roof frame and heavy glass panels. Her head and chest injuries were too severe to survive. The final finding was not that anyone caused the storm. It was sudden and stronger than expected. But the old roof had shown wear, and the hail exposed a weakness that should have been taken more seriously before guests were allowed beneath it during bad weather. The venue closed after the incident. Temporary fencing went up while the roof was rebuilt.
Maeve's family asked that people remember her as more than the accident. She was a friend, a bridesmaid, and someone who used her last clear moments to move children out of danger.
Our next story starts with a family posing for what should have been a simple wedding photo by the roadside. It was August 27th, 2017, in Big Sur, California. The wedding party had stopped at a roadside overlook beside a coastal bridge after the ceremony. Cars and trucks were still passing behind them. A small viewing area set behind a low barrier where the family planned to take one important photo. Julianne Van Camp was 30 and worked as a veterinarian. She could calm a scared dog, talk gently to a worried owner, and remember small details that mattered. She had just married Miles, and her reason for being there was simple. She wanted to recreate a wedding photo her parents had taken there years before.
That photo meant a lot to her family. Julianne had grown up seeing it in their hallway. When she got engaged, she wanted one like it because it connected her day to theirs.
Honestly, I get why that mattered to her. It was not about the photo looking perfect. It was about standing where her parents once stood. The plan was quick. The photographer would take a few shots. Then, Everyone would drive to the reception. Friends watched from several feet back. Two relatives held Julianne's dress off the rough ground. The overlook was not closed to traffic. The wedding coordinator stood near the entrance to the pullout, helping arriving guests park safely and keeping an eye on vehicles entering and leaving. But traffic on the highway continued as normal. That stretch had tight curves, slow tourists, and work trucks passing through. A construction truck came around the bend, carrying long steel posts and wood. Later, witnesses said the load looked uneven. One strap appeared loose, though no one had enough time or reason to react before the truck reached the overlook. The photographer placed Julianne and Miles fully inside the marked viewing area, several feet behind the low barrier, close enough to frame the bridge. Julianne adjusted her dress, turned toward Miles, and waited. Then the truck passed. Witnesses heard a sharp shift from the back of the truck. A long steel post came loose, struck the pavement, skipped across the shoulder, and slid past the open end of the barrier before anyone could move. Investigators later found the path made sense. The truck was moving with traffic. Because the road curved and the viewing area sat close to the lane, the post only needed a few feet of bad direction. Julianne was hit near the low barrier. Miles was knocked down but survived. Guests scattered. The wedding coordinator rushed toward the injured group while other guests flagged the driver. The truck stopped farther down the road after people shouted and honked.
That is the ugly part for me. Nobody was showing off. Nobody was taking some wild risk. They were just trying to finish one family picture.
Emergency crews treated Julianne at the overlook before taking her to the hospital. The reception was canceled before the wedding party arrived. Most guests heard only that there had been an accident until later that night. Julianne died from her injuries at the hospital. Miles survived with broken bones and deep bruising. Investigators reviewed photos, the truck, and the cargo straps. They found the materials had not been secured for a curved coastal road. One strap was worn, another had been placed too high, and the steel posts shifted when the truck came around the bend. The medical examiner determined that Julianne died from blunt force injuries to her head and upper body caused by the loose steel post. The official conclusion was that the crash was caused by improperly secured cargo, not the wedding party standing outside the marked viewing space. The driver was cited for an unsecured load and later faced charges tied to the fatal crash. Afterward, officials increased checks on work trucks using that coastal route.
A strap that should have held became that thing that failed. And that failure landed on a person who had no chance to stop it. There was nothing Julianne could have done.
Julianne's family never kept the recreated photo. The next story begins at a reception dessert table, where a broken chocolate fountain turned one man's offer to help into a fatal mistake. It was April 9th, 2016, in Portland, Oregon. The reception was inside a small rented banquet hall behind a family-owned restaurant. The dessert table sat near the back wall, close to an outlet with a rented chocolate fountain in the middle. That outlet, that table, and that machine became the reason the night changed. Gideon Lockhart was 34 and worked as an HVAC technician. He fixed heaters, air units, and small building problems. So in his family, he was the person everyone called when something stopped working. He was the groom's older brother, there to celebrate and help keep small problems away from his brother. Earlier that day, Gideon helped move chairs, checked a noisy vent, and carried boxes without making a big deal of it. So when the dessert table started having trouble, nobody thought it was strange that his name came up.
I think every family has a Gideon. They're the ones who never seem to get a chance to be the guests because they can't let go if there is something that needs to be fixed.
The chocolate fountain came from a local party supply company. Caterers filled it and let it run while guests came up with strawberries, cookies, and cake. For a while, it worked fine. People took photos around it. Children kept circling the table. Then the flow slowed. The chocolate thickened near the top, and the motor made a rough sound. One catering worker reached behind the table and flipped the switch off. Another worker saw the fountain stop moving and assumed it had been unplugged. In the noise of music, guests talking, and plates being cleared, that mistake spread as if true. The rental company was cold, but they were across town. Dessert service had started, and the fountain was the main draw. A caterer asked Gideon if he could look for a simple clog, not open the machine or touch wiring. Gideon hesitated. He was in dress clothes and had no tools, but many small machine problems are just stuck parts or clogged openings.
And he had been told it was off and unplugged. That one assumption was enough.
He stepped behind the dessert table while a caterer held the cloth aside. The cord ran behind the skirted table into a crowded power strip, and the area was damp from spilled chocolate and wiped down trays. Gideon did not move the table or trace the cord back. He trusted what he had been told and checked the base. Inside the rented machine, inspectors later found a worn wire that should have been repaired before the unit was sent out. The damaged wire had rubbed against the metal body of the fountain, causing the outside of the machine to become live whenever it remained plugged into the outlet. Although the switch had been turned off, the damaged wiring still left the metal base energized because the fountain had never been unplugged. Gideon touched the base with one hand while steadying the table with the other. Witnesses saw his body stiffen before he collapsed. At first, some guests thought he had slipped. Then, a worker reached for the metal tray under the fountain and felt a small shock, which made everyone back away.
I honestly think I would have believed the exact same thing they did. If someone tells you a machine is unplugged, you usually don't stop to double check it yourself.
Someone called for the power to be cut. A staff member reached the wall, pulled the main plug, and moved the power strip away. Only then did guests get close enough to help Gideon. CPR began, while others moved children and older guests away. Emergency crews arrived and continued treatment before taking him to the hospital. The reception ended almost immediately. The groom left still wearing his suit, following the ambulance carrying his brother. The medical examiner determined that Gideon died from electrocution, meaning an electric shock disrupted his heart until it stopped. Electricity had passed through his body because the fountain's metal base was live while he was touching it. Inspectors found a hidden wiring fault and a history of poor repairs. They also discovered the catering company had no policy requiring defective equipment to be unplugged before anyone tried to handle it. The official finding was that Gideon's death was caused by unsafe rental equipment and a mistaken belief that the machine had no power. His choice to help made sense, but the people around him were working with wrong information. The hardest part for me is knowing Gideon wasn't trying to fix something dangerous. He thought he was doing one last favor for his little brother before getting back to the celebration. The rental company removed similar fountains from service. The catering group changed its rules too. If a machine failed, nobody touched it until someone could see the plug out of the wall. Our last story begins before the vows are even finished, where years of resentment quietly followed one family into the ceremony and ended with a wedding becoming a crime scene. It was June 4th, 2022 in Asheville, North Carolina. The wedding was held at a small private event barn outside town with a grass ceremony area behind it. At the front stood a handmade ceremonial arch built from thick, solid timber beams by relatives. The frame weighed several hundred pounds and was anchored upright with heavy wooden posts, then decorated with flowers and fabric. The couple planned to stand beneath it during a family blessing. Marion Sterlingworth was 63 and a retired librarian. She was Alaric Sterlingworth's mother and had spent months helping with the wedding. Her son was getting married, and she wanted the day to feel steady and love. Marion helped fold programs, check seating, and place older relatives near the aisle. The arch mattered because Alaric's uncles and cousins had built it together as a sign of both families joining.
I've been to weddings where there's someone exactly like Marion. They're never the loudest person in the room, but somehow they're the reason everything runs smoothly.
Outside the wedding, trouble had been building for years. Alaric's family had been fighting with a neighboring family over a strip of land beside the property line. It started with fences and survey papers, then became angry visits and small acts of damage. Weeks before the wedding, someone scratched cars near the barn and cut string lights along the fence. The barn had a camera near the back service gate, used for deliveries, but no one watched it live. The gate was left unlocked for early vendor drop-offs. That morning, staff walked the ceremony area. The arch looked stable. The damage was on the backside, low near the base, where flowers and fabric covered it. No one knew that 2 support bolts had been loosened and 1 lower brace had been partly cut. The ceremony began without trouble. Alaric and his bride stood under the arch. Marian sat in the front row beside 2 young flower girls and an older aunt who used a cane. Near the end, both families stepped forward to tie ribbons to the side posts. As relatives tied the ribbons, the light pulling motion put pressure on the weakened side. Witnesses said the arch shifted. Then one side dipped. A cousin reached for it but could not hold the weight. The loose bolts gave way and the cut brace split. The arch fell toward the front row. Alaric pulled his bride back as guests near the aisle scrambled out of the way. Marian, however, moved toward the flower girls and her aunt. She pushed one child behind a chair and reached for her aunt's arm. That choice placed her directly beneath the falling side of the arch. One witness said Marian moved almost immediately. It wasn't some dramatic act of sacrifice. It sounded more like a mother's instinct taking over before anyone had time to think. The heavy timber side of the arch, built from thick, solid wooden beams, struck Marian across the head and shoulder and pinned her to the grass. Alaric was hit by smaller pieces while pulling his bride away, and both survived. Guests struggled to lift the fallen timber frame, needing several people working together before Marian could be reached. Emergency crews treated Marian on the grass before taking her to the hospital. She did not survive. The medical examiner determined that Marian died from blunt force injuries to her head and chest after the wooden side struck and pinned her. The frame hit with more force than her body could survive. At first, many guests believed it was a building mistake, but investigators found tool marks on the brace and bolt threads showing they had been loosened shortly before the ceremony. The service gate camera showed a person entering after setup the night before. Nearby road footage identified the person as Gavin Bloom, 51, a member of the neighboring family involved in the long-running land dispute with Alaric's relatives. Detectives matched the cut on the brace to a small saw found during a search of Bloom's property. Investigators could not prove exactly whom Bloom expected to hurt, but the timing showed the arch had been deliberately weakened so it would fail during the ceremony. Bloom was later convicted for causing Marian's death and injuring the couple.
I honestly thought this was a construction failure. Learning the arch had been sabotaged changed everything.
The official finding was clear. Marian did not die because the relatives built the arch badly or because guests stood too close. She died because the support was deliberately weakened before the ceremony, causing the frame to fail when people gathered around it. Alaric and his wife later started a small scholarship in Marian's name for local students who loved books. It fit her better than any courtroom headline ever could, because Marian had been the person handing children stories and telling them they had a future.